Good morning, and welcome to Communication During a Domestic Terrorism or Mass Violence Incident. This webinar is being recorded under the auspices of the ICPTTA program, which I will tell you a little bit more about in a moment. We have the incredible privilege to have two wonderful professionals who are going to walk you through lessons learned, best practices for communicating during the really tough events. And I am going to start by having them introduce themselves. So Jay Bonafide, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Tara. My name is Jay Bonafide. I am the Division Communications Director for the Central Atlantic Division of the American Red Cross. I've been with the organization for almost 11 years now and have responded to many both natural and man-made disasters over the course of that time, and spent about 15 years in local newsrooms before joining the Red Cross.
Excellent. Thank you. Cassidy Carlson, please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Cassidy Carlson, and I am currently serving as a commander for the Aurora Police Department in Colorado. And in 2012, I was the lead PIO, Public Information Officer, for the Aurora Police Department when we experienced the Aurora Theater shooting in our community. I've been in policing for the last 19 years, has held various ranks and positions. That's what brings me to the table today.
Excellent. Thank you both. And again, my name is Tara Hughes. I am the director of the ICPTTA program. The full name of the program is Improving Community Preparedness to Assist Victims of Mass Violence or Domestic Terrorism Training and Technical Assistance Program, which is a fairly ridiculous title, so we shortened it to ICPTTA. What we do is we come in to communities and we assist them in adding in victim care components to the existing emergency response plans. So if that means helping them create a mass violence annex that includes victim care, that's great. If it's an already existing plan and they just want to infuse these pieces into it, we can do that as well. It's very individualized to the programs or to the communities, I'm sorry. And they have assigned consultants who will work with them. We also have a series of trainings. This is one of them that are on our website. And once communities watch these trainings, we can offer individualized customization for your community. So if you watch this and you decide that this is something that you want to do, but are not sure of technically how to fit it into your plan, we'll have contact information at the end of the presentation. We are a couple of things to know as we move forward. One is when we talk about when we talk about mass violence and domestic terrorism, we are talking about some pretty specific criminal events. And so one of the reasons we have Cassidy here as a police department PIO is because there are some uniquenesses to these responses that need to be thought about. But in addition to that, we're really talking about a criminal event, and therefore there are certain things that are available to the victims and to the people who are directly impacted and the people who are indirectly impacted. So you're going to hear talk today about victims of these events. And victim is defined as someone who is directly impacted. That's a direct victim. We also have indirect victims, which are people who care about the direct victims and interact with them on a regular basis. So when we talk about victims, we're talking pretty specifically about a certain set of people. That is distinct in some ways from the community at large. And you're going to hear Jay and Cassidy talk about both sort of speaking to the victims in particular, but then also speaking to the community. So we're going to separate those two as we sort of move forward. I'm going to pass it over to Cassidy so she can talk about some definitions to really sort of get us on a level playing field.
Thanks, Tara. So we do see different definitions when it comes to mass violence and terrorism. Here at ICP, when we talk about mass violence, what we mean is means an intentional violent criminal act that results in physical, emotional, or psychological harm to a sufficiently large number of people. We do not define that number of people by a specific number. You might see some definitions that do, but we do not. And then, of course, terrorism activities involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the US or any state, and appears to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government, intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. And one of the things I think it's important is different communities are going to feel different things in different ways. Well, and that's why we don't use a number to define mass violence. In a smaller community, something may impact the whole community, where if it happened in a large urban city, similar situation could be completely different. So that was something that we considered as we put this together. And then next, we want to kind of define the phases of response to mass tragedy. So first is the planning phase, and this is what this webinar is about, and the other resources that we'll share with you today, and what ICP does. And this is just so that you're ready, no matter what your capacity is in your community. And then it falls into the immediate acute phase, and that's going to be when the incident happens. So this is during the incident and the immediate aftermath, the true chaos of when a mass violence incident hits your community. Then we move into the immediate transitional phase, and then that's up to the first remembrance date, which is usually at the year mark, and through completion of prosecution. If your community, like mine, had to deal also with a court case following the mass violence incident, that could be a long process. A lot of things happen in that time where we need to make sure that we're including the victims and the families, and making sure that they're still engaged in the loop and have all the information they need during that process. Then we move to the long-term recovery phase. This is usually about the 18-month mark. We could be experiencing some appeals, or later down the road, maybe some parole hearings. Also, memorial dedications are being built, possibly, in the community, things like that. And then other remembrances moving forward. And all of these markers will affect people in different ways, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then ultimately, we always end up back in a planning phase. It's a cycle. So, unfortunately, we can't be naive to think just because we had one incident, here in my community, doesn't mean it can't happen again. And that's the reality we live in, and it's sad. But we always have to get back into that planning phase and learn. If you've been through this experience, you're going to take things that you've learned and keep planning and keep improving.
Thanks. I just want to point something out as we're talking about communications and words matter. You're going to notice both in the intermediate or the immediate phase and the long-term phase that the word remembrance is used. What we used to use was first anniversary. We used to use that word all the time. And what we heard very clearly from people who had experienced these incidents personally and as communities was that felt like it really downplayed the emotional impact of the day and the year that had passed and all of that. And so we are changing the language now and using the word remembrance or the 1-year mark or the 5-year mark, as opposed to using the word anniversary. So just wanted to throw that in there.
All right. So, we talked about getting back to planning here, and we've come up with, and we talked a little bit, Tara was talking about the best practice of remembrance versus anniversary and a lesson learned there. And I think through those best practices and experience and talking with subject matter experts, ICP has come up with these 16 best practices for that planning process that you see before and after an event. And so obviously you can see there's a lot to be thinking about and a lot to have in mind when one of these things happen. But today we're focusing on number 6, which is public information and crisis. So what is that role of communications and PIOs, public information officers, when we're talking about one of these incidents occurring? The biggest thing and the most important thing is that people need to know what services you're providing and how they can access them. And sometimes it's reassuring to a community just to know that someone is there, to know that your agency, your organization is, quote, on the job, as it said. As a PIO, as a communicator, one of the key things you're going to be doing here is advising your leadership on communications issues. This is going to affect the entire organization. Everyone might end up really representing them at some point. So you want to make sure your leadership, that you're providing that expert advice to leadership about communications issues. Keep in mind that people are going to be upset. So there's a pretty good chance that some criticism may be coming your way. And so we want to mitigate those issues as best we can. And one of the things you can do is try to get ahead of that and manage those expectations ahead of time. Let people know what your agency does do and what it doesn't do, because that can really, having those expectations set ahead of time can really help in that mitigation process, to the point of maybe even avoiding some of those issues that may come up.
So one of the most important things that you can do, no matter what type of agency you work with, is to prepare for a mass casualty incident. And so some of the ways that you can do that are network with others across the fields of communication. We're very fortunate here in Colorado. We have a very robust group of PIOs that's been meeting, for the last 25 years, and we use it for networking, training, and I lean on them heavily when I was dealing with the theater shooting. So that's something you could do, meeting with your partners on a regular basis, start to form that group if you don't already have one. Another important thing is getting involved in tabletop exercises. That we do a pretty good job, in the policing field, doing tactical exercises, the hands-on stuff. But there's a way that a PIO can get involved in that, the communications team. If you know of a large-scale tactical exercise happening in your community, find ways to get involved, get into your role as a PIO, start thinking what you would do if this was really occurring, who you would need to contact, who you'd need to bring to the table. All those things are going to play out if an incident happens. And, that old adage, you play as well as you practice. And I think that is very true. Another thing that you can do unfortunately, we see this happening all over, mass violence incidents. So when you see something happening in a different community, put that into your community as far as, okay, if that were to happen here, how would I respond? Who would I contact? And really just getting into that role. And that's something you could do to help prepare if an incident happens in your community.
So this is Tara again. I just want to throw in there that in the last 24 hours, to go to the last point Cassidy was talking about, there were a number of people shot in a Kroger in Tennessee, and Rigby, Idaho, which had a shooting in a middle school in May, had another one yesterday in that same school. So we're talking about things that are happening more often, and we're seeing as people are coming out of the pandemic that some of the things that may have been dealt with differently are now being dealt with in this way. So I think there's plenty of opportunity, unfortunately, to think about, if you were in their shoes, what would you do? Who would you call? Who is needed? Because those are two very different instances. And very different populations being impacted. So what would you need to do in terms of talking with those two very distinct groups? You think about a middle school, and one of the biggest communications challenges is going to be with parents. So think, how would you deal with that, and move forward from there? Back to you, Cassidy.
Another thing that you can do is go to training now. Obviously, you're listening to this webinar. That's awesome. There's so many great resources out there from people with experiences, professionals in the field, and we've listed some of those resources there. OVC, of course, is a great resource. Everything that ICP is providing, those are things that will help you prepare. And anything you can do now will help you be more confident and more skilled for when an incident happens. One of the things that I like to talk about is identifying people within your organization now and identify roles for them in the event that you're in this situation. So, for example, thinking outside the box, for us with Aurora, we had an individual who was background in recruiting unit, but he was very, very good at social media. And I recognized that. I knew his skill set. And so when our shooting happened, I grabbed him and I said, hey, I need you to run social media. Because clearly recruiting and background unit was not busy at that time. And all of our resources were being focused on what we were dealing with the shooting. So it was, now that was on the fly, but what I'm suggesting is that you start identifying people. Don't put out, if you have, for us in law enforcement, a skilled civilian that, you can identify to help with certain things is a great asset. Having IT people identified that could possibly help you, all that will just help you so you're not scrambling when it happens. And then that can also help when you're, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but your JIC, your Joint Information Center, identifying people that can assist there. And then I always say work smarter, not harder. We've gotten really good at this in all aspects, but especially when it comes to public communication. When the theater shooting happened in 2012, I quickly realized that we were just getting into using Facebook and Twitter, but I knew that's how that I was going to reach out to the public and the media at the exact same time, because that was very important for us, is that everybody got the same message at the same time, not filtered, that it was straight from the source as the police department, and pushing that out there. So, every single day you can work on social media, get proficient at it, share those good stories that are happening in your community, getting proficient at it. And being in communications, that's probably something you're doing every day. So think about how you would use it and what platform you would use when a mass violence incident occurs, and how you want to do that. I would suggest doing just one, not using all your platforms. So figuring out which one works best, because that's just too much to manage. You could have conflicting information or something like that. But if you just want everybody to go to your Twitter, then that's where you push out the information. Something else that I would suggest that you can implement today is having a designated media email address for media to inquire with your agency, and separate phone numbers. If you are somebody who's put your cell phone number out to the local media and it's worked up until now, then when a mass violence incident happens, your phone is going to be rendered useless because it's just going to be blowing up. So I really suggest having separate numbers, and maybe something that could be transferred to other people that may step into your role. One way that we've done that is through Google Voice. It's a free app that you can find, is a great resource for us. It allows you to, when things are too crazy, you can actually put it on a do not disturb or put an automatic message out where you could, maybe put your updated information, or advise people, please follow our Twitter page or something like that. So it just makes things more efficient, more streamlined, and some continuity in the message. And that's the important part as we move through this.
Yeah, and Cassidy talked about that importance of delivering your information to the public and the media, at the same time that it's coming directly from you. And hopefully that, you're going to be able to do that because you've prepared, you're going to be ready to go. One of the things you're going to want to do, everybody's going to be in kind of a panic when something like this happens. So if you can be the calmest person in the room and try to bring everybody back down, that's going to be a huge help while you're delivering that message to the media and the public, and making sure your agency is doing the same, because again, your role as an advisor is going to be super important, because everyone is dealing with the crisis, and it's going to take your whole team to get through it. So you need to think about what the public's going to need to know in that first hour, after an incident occurs. Is there an ongoing public safety threat? Where do you want people to go? And where do you want them not to go? If you get an influx of people at the crime scene or at the incident scene, that's going to get in the way of what every agency there is trying to do. So we want to make sure we let people know where they want to go. Hopefully, you've identified already in some of that pre-planning you've done, talked about in some of the other, presentations through ICP, but hopefully you know where some of the locations and partners for a family and friend notification center, both the location and the partners that should be there. You're going to want to identify that and Cassidy talked about making sure you have information lines and information channels. You want to make sure those are set up and manned to provide information, and that people know, what they are, that's part of that message that you're delivering out to the public, so that they can know where they can get help and how they can help.
So I'm just going to put a plug in for what Jay was just talking about in terms of the notification center. So the first place that people are going, their biggest need is information. And so you will ideally have a direct line into that notification center, and somebody there who can give that information out, or can direct people to the Twitter page or whatever you want to do from really from a PIO perspective. But having somebody who is thinking about the information that needs to get to those people, because that is their only concern at that point. Was my person involved? Where might they be? What's happening? And are we safe? Like, those are the things people need to know. And so figuring out how to get information directly to that center can be really helpful, moving just to make sure that that's a very large group of people. And if you can give information at the same time, it helps with all the calm and all of that stuff.
For sure. And again, we talk about the calm there, but there are some common reactions. I mean, everyone, of course, reacts differently to stress, but there are some common reactions and things to look for. They're a little bit different in adults versus kids, but there are pieces here. You kind of see the 5 bullets, where they are. And it's important that you start to recognize some of these examples. Practice self-care. You might start to recognize them within yourself. Be patient with everyone. The Red Cross has a great class called Psychological First Aid that can help with presenting some of this and really normalizing some of these things for the people that have been affected, and yourselves as the responders to it too. So some examples for cognitive things, like a difficulty concentrating. You become obsessed with the details of the trauma. Just a couple of examples. There's so many. In a spiritual, you may change your relationship with the higher power, or even abandon it. Question that, like, why did this happen? Why, question the beliefs of other people. These are, again, common reactions to think about. And there's physical reactions too. You might get a stress headache, a stomach ache. You might become more aggressive just because you're more stressed than you normally are as you see all of these situations. Behavioral, and there's so many here. Think about children, that their classroom is going to be disrupted. They may refuse to go to school. There could be some eating disorders. Even in adults, we might again become aggressive, have fewer social contacts. You might reject your peers, or be rejected by your peers just because you're involved in this situation. I think emotional is something that you see even more here. Is obviously with the Red Cross, we deal with natural disasters a lot. I think there may even be more emotion in a situation like this, and those, that anxiety, that panic, your helplessness. You feel helpless. What can we do here? Again, you become irritable. There's so much going on that you get stressed out, or maybe even the opposite. You become numb to some of these things and the way people feel. And it's so important that you continue to keep that empathy. You can sometimes, and especially, you're going to have that anxiety, separation anxiety, guilt, that you're able to help and that you're not affected. So these are all common reactions that you can recognize, and you can help using some of those psychological first aid tips, and just by simply being empathetic and by thinking. And in fact, the picture on this slide is from the Boston Marathon bombing afterwards. And Tara was a part of that response, as was I. And Tara's group was able to work with the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority and basically put some coping tips, some of these things to expect and things that you can do to help yourself and others get through them, in every train and every subway in the Boston area for a few weeks. And so I think that thinking about those partners too, I mean, that's a perfect example of a different way to get your word out. There was a foundation that wanted to help. And this was kind of a missing need. It was a need. It was a void to try to get this messaging out. And so this was a great way to do that with the general public, to leverage somebody that wanted to help in a different way and get that message out to everyone. And I know Tara and I have talked that people will still ask about that. And it's been almost, it's been 8-9 years now since that attack. And so that definitely has an impact on people.
I will just say, Jay, that I now work in a medical tent for the Boston Marathon every year. And every year, at least one person on the day talks about those signs and seeing those signs. And you're right, we're 9 years out. So it's been a long time and they're still talking about them. So,
so now, again, we've talked about it a lot, but I think you can't emphasize it enough that these incidents in particular, they're not about us. They're not about you or your agency. They're about the victims. And so even when you've got all those microphones in front of you, it's important to remember who we're talking about and why we're having these conversations. The entire community is going to be on edge. So it's important, again, to talk about some of those things we saw in the last slide and acknowledge those things and talk about it's normal to feel this way, and some of those tips in your general feeling. Acknowledge that uncertainty that people have, that fear, that pain. But I think it's also important that you're as transparent and honest as possible. No one's going to have all the answers in these situations. And it's so important that you stay in your lane. And we're going to talk more about that later, but you never want to speculate on something that you don't know or that your agency is not the lead agency on. Because again, this is a community disaster. It's going to take a community response. Whatever your agency is, you have one role that you're in it, and you never want to speculate or talk about somebody else's role. And you never want to give misinformation trying to give too much. You should stick to what you know, but then say, we'll get you that answer. We'll let you know that as soon as you can, and let people know. Cassidy talked earlier about having, the lines of communication and where you want to send people, whether it's Twitter, whether it's, let them know when you're going to get more information and where they can go to get it. Again, we talked about this. You also, people want to know what's happening and what they can do. And so I think, again, we can't emphasize enough to not over reassure people either. If it's not a safe situation, you don't want to say it's a safe situation. You want to make sure that people know what they need to do to keep themselves safe, just as one example. Again, never speculate or guess, but let people know that you'll get that information to them when you can. And let people know those things that they can do to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. We talk a lot about preparedness and things you can stock up. Obviously, now we're into the incident already, but what are some things that they can do? Can they do welfare checks on their neighbors? Can they, check in on family members? Again, recognize some of those steps and some of those common reactions, and think about how you can help someone be through that. So let people know, because in that immediate incident, that's going to be on the main mind of the public that may not be directly affected. The folks that may not be going to that friend and family notification center is, how do I avoid this? How do I keep myself and my loved ones safe? And so letting them know, even if it's simple common sense things like sheltering in place at home or avoiding a certain area, and then obviously some of those other things to talk about with their family, just check in and go through. I think it's really important to kind of empower people to help themselves in situations like this.
So now in this part, things are going to be chaotic is the best way to describe them. People will be in a panic. And so the more information that we can get out, the more calm we can bring to the chaos. So what you want to start doing is make sure you're coordinating with your colleagues from other agencies from the very beginning. And that's to avoid mixed messages, to avoid, different people speaking. And again, it all goes back to planning. These people should have been identified. You should have relationships with them. It should be a quick, easy phone call, getting that group together. So identifying who's affected. We've talked about schools, and maybe it's somebody that if it's at a business, a grocery store that we've seen, getting with their communications team. That might not have been somebody you've coordinated with, but recognizing that's who needs to be involved, depending on what has occurred for the incident in your community. It also helps when you get people together as soon as possible, all the players to the table. It makes sure that everyone stays in their own lane. We've said that before. It's very important. And it helps identify what questions are going to be handled by what group, by what entity. So it very clearly defines that. For us in Aurora, what we did is we brought everybody to the table, including elected officials who I would highly, highly encourage you to bring them to the table very early. And what we said is we set some ground rules, and we just said the police department's going to be the lead agency, clearly, because it was a criminal act. We were the lead investigation team. And we set those rules, and we said nobody will go do an individual interview. If you plan to speak at a press conference, you will come to a briefing. We'll talk about press conferences here in a minute, but we really set those ground rules very early on, and luckily everybody played by the rules and for our incident. The other thing that you're going to want to do early, we've talked about, what is your primary source of information? So again, focus on whatever one site, one page or platform that's going to have the most stated information where you want people to go. Times have changed. You can't answer your phone all the time when this is going on. I used to know the number, but I think within the first few hours, we had thousands of calls that we were able to, that we knew were coming in. And there's no way that a PIO or two can answer all of that. That is impossible. Again, don't worry about the phone calls necessarily. I would encourage you, you do need to check those lines. So that's a good place to put somebody that you've identified. Maybe it's that civilian that works in your office that can help check phone lines, because what we found is this real need for information from people in the community looking for loved ones, that sort of thing. And we want to make sure that we filter those out, and we can, if we need to make a phone call back, that we give that number to maybe a victim advocate or somebody's calling in with information. If you are dealing with a suspect and you're from an investigation standpoint, you're trying to get more information. People were calling in different phone lines because they're eager to get that out. So they're just looking on the internet, finding a phone number and calling it. So it is important to check those phone lines that the numbers are out in the public, so you're not missing very important information, like those examples I just gave. Something that kind of interesting to think about is maybe creating your own hashtag. I know that sounds weird, but this is the world we live in. So, and then you can own it if you're the lead agency, and then that's the hashtag that people will follow, and you have some control over it instead of letting a media entity or somebody else create it. That just something little to think about, but these are just the things that happen when things are rapidly occurring.
Hey, Cassidy, can I throw something in there just about that sort of hashtag idea?
Huh?
The interestingly, what we hear now is immediately people start to use the name of the area or the city and the word strong. So Boston Strong started after the Boston Marathon, all of those kinds of things. What we hear just in terms of creating this hashtag, what we hear from people who have lived through these experiences is that they hate that. They hate the word strong being added in there. And part of it is that they don't feel strong, and they feel like there's a lot of pressure to be strong when they don't feel that way. And just as a point of interest, the Boston Strong tag came from 2 local college students who just started to use it, and they started that hashtag, and it literally now is used across the world when these things happen. So thinking about what you want to use and maybe avoiding those types of words might be helpful.
Thank you, Tara. Something to think about early too is donation management. The community is always going to be quick to want to help. People will show up to the site if you don't tell them specifically where to go. So that's something you want to get out there early. But people just want to bring it's from the goodness of their heart, but they're bringing things like clothing, homemade food, and different things like that. Again, from a good place, but can kind of take resources if you haven't planned for it. So that's something to think about. Put that out there early about where you would like donations to go. I would suggest, somewhere offsite, not close, in our case, to the police department, something like that, and have it managed. And just to take note of that will happen, and it happens very early. The other thing is there will be some legitimate donation sites where people might be opening up for victims' families for money donations. However, unfortunately, people try to capitalize on these incidents for personal gain, and scams are a real thing. So I would encourage you to identify which donation sites are legit, and maybe it can be something that there's some oversight of. So that if there are monetary donations, that they go to one place and that is the legit site. Otherwise, you see a bunch of crowdsourcing fun things that people are pushing around. So as the lead agency, you may not be in a position that you're asking for donations, probably not. But if you start to see scams, as we did, I think it's important that you do put that out there, and identify which ones are the legit ones. So just things that you don't think about when you're in the middle of a situation. And of course, the most important thing to focus on is the victims. Make sure that all communications are handled in a professional, empathetic, and subdued manner. The focus should be on the victims and their families, and letting them know someone is there to help. These, and that, again, that's the most important thing, is focusing on the victims and that empathetic piece as you're delivering your message. And if you're not the spokesperson out in front of the cameras, that you really relay that to the executive, to the chief or whomever is going to be doing those press conferences. And that's really important.
Yeah, and another thing to watch for is you're monitoring both traditional and social media as fake news. It's unfortunately a thing these days. People are going to, whether it's intentional, trying to get attention, or it's unintentional, and they're trying to share something, but they don't have full information. It's going to get there. And so it's not just posting on social media, it's social engagement. It's having somebody who's dedicated to monitor those conversations and do more than post content. They'll see some of that misinformation bubble up and be able to get it. But again, as we've said before, people are desperate for information. They're desperate for help. They might be posting on those pages too, like, we're here and we need this and we need this assistance. And so it's really important to have someone monitoring those, and doing the same thing with traditional media too. Again, reporters are talking to people in the field, and that's where the public is still going to go for trusted information. So if they hear something and they start giving misinformation, chances are they're going to want to correct that misinformation, but you need to know it's there in order to know it's there, and then be able to contact that reporter or that outlet and let them know that's unfortunately incorrect information, and we want to make sure you're getting this vital, accurate information out to the public correctly. So really making sure you're monitoring both traditional and social media for that. And it really is important. It's important enough to dedicate someone specifically to it if you have the resources to do so. Again, we've talked about it before, and I would add social media to the second bullet too, about monitoring public email addresses and phone numbers that are listed for your organization. As we say, hopefully you're getting out immediately where you want people to go, but people are just going to be desperate in a situation like this for information. And so they're going to find whatever they can find that's listed. They're going to find that phone number that's online, or that Facebook page that says something about your organization. And so they're going to go out there and do that. And those people that are leaving messages, they may be a family member or a victim, or a family member of a victim, or a witness, or somebody that really needs to be followed up with in a very timely manner. So making sure that while you're trying to focus it on that one publicly given phone number, that one publicly given social online platform, that you are monitoring the other ones too, because there's no way that you're going to be able to stop everybody from doing that. Cassidy's going to talk more about the JICs in a second, but again, it's important there also that you're working with each other, the other agencies that are there, and monitoring any public phone numbers that are given out during that time. Again, we talked about having a separate media line to try and separate some of that piece of it from, those family members that may be trying to get through. And it's also important to consider sharing other resources that might be helpful. A mental health hotline. We talked about donations. If you know what agency or what group or what that vetted donation organization or group is, make sure you get that information out to try to limit those scams that are going through if you're promoting that one. And also a tip line. We're talking about these situations that, there may be witnesses that have help. So getting that phone number out and directing those calls away from some of the other places where you want other information to come in more directly can be very helpful as well.
When we talk about the Joint Information Center, this is something you can do in the preparation stage. Make sure you have the physical things you need for the JIC to include whiteboards, any technology needs, those kind of things. While it may be something that's set up at different locations depending on your community, but I would go ahead and plan for it to be at your whatever would work, your headquarters building if you're police or whatever, and just having that stuff available. We're going to have all representations from all the affected agencies at the table. It's going to be the centralized location for information. Again, this having a JIC makes things more efficient and effective when things are all in one place. Really helps with the messaging. And if done right, any professional PIO should be able to fill this role and assist, because all the information that is okay to release that has previously been released should be available to anybody that comes and works in the JIC. The way we did it with Aurora is we did a bullet point list, and I'll show you that in just a second. And so we kept those bullet points up as the days went on and as information was added. The other thing, kind of logistically, you might run operational periods. You kind of start talking about ICS models, but so you might be looking at working shifts. You might need 24/7 coverage. You may not, depending. But leaning on people again in that professional networking agency, hopefully, or excuse me, that professional group that you work with, lean on those people to help you fill those shifts and worry about that kind of stuff, kind of that logistical stuff. Because you'll be very busy if you're the lead PIO, and just figuring out what that's going to look like. And then just have all resource numbers available. So when somebody calls in or intercepts, that we have those mental health line numbers readily available in the JIC. Those kind of that kind of information is going to be very important. So this next slide is just an example of what we did in Aurora. It was very clear cut of what information we had released. So again, anybody sitting in the JIC could look at this and know it's okay to release this information. This is something that has been released and verified. And we just kept it updated, and it was broken up into different parts. The general information, as we learn about victims, that was a section. Resource donation management was a section in our list, so that all the information was right there. We also did, I'm a firm believer in no secrets. Everybody should get the information at the exact same time when it's appropriate to put out that information. And so, after we did press conferences, we did these bullet points, and then we posted them on our website. We put a link on our Twitter and Facebook, things like that, so that everybody was very clear on what information was put out.
Hey, Cassidy, before we move on, can I ask a question? Were there any hiccups with that? Were there challenging either agencies or people that maybe were trying to put out information early or were adding information when they were putting it out? I just as a thought that I know I've from the outside of a JIC known that there's been some struggles in a JIC that I've been involved with. And just wondering if you had that in Aurora and how you managed that.
No, it was, as far as the communication piece, everybody stayed in their lane. They really did. We didn't have any issues about any entity getting out ahead of something or putting something out that wasn't agreed upon. Everybody really did let the police department be the lead, and we didn't really see that. So I know that happens, and part of it is we're a very large city, and the jurisdiction of the event didn't include any other law enforcement agency other than from a mutual aid standpoint, and so really it was easy for us to control everything. And having established partnerships with the district attorney's office, our city communications people, which is a little bit different entity for us, but just everybody coming together early on and setting those boundaries. We didn't see that. And then the other professional PIOs that I leaned on from our state professional PIO group, ESPIOC, they were tremendous help, amazing people, and had no other interest, and we're just really there to help, and it worked out well for us.
Okay, great.
And if I can add something, I think what we see a lot is if somebody's going to get out in front of something, it's often an elected official who has the best intentions. They want to tell their constituents that they're doing something or that there's something available. But I think that's why it's so important to include them or their press people in the briefings and in the information, those local, both the local and the representatives, at higher levels from there as much as possible, just to make sure they understand that there's a reason that the bullets are here, that we're only sharing what we have, and to make sure that try to include them. It's another reason to try to include them in the official press conferences too, because you have the chance to give them that briefing ahead of time, because that, more so than other agencies, I think that's the challenge, and it certainly that I've seen, and it certainly comes from the best place. But I think that doing those briefings that Cassidy talked about earlier and including them in those can try to get in front of that.
That's a great segue, Jay. So when we talk about press conferences, again, briefing all speakers, if bringing in all those community leaders, elected officials, and making sure everybody's on the same page, be clear on who is saying what and how much time they'll have. And again, I think it's very important in those briefings that you remind everybody in the room, it's about the victims. It's about, and really bringing that focus back. And so that's what's happening before. Everybody's very clear on what's being said and who's saying it. And we had that standing, the ground rules. I said that we said, if you weren't at the briefing, you weren't speaking. And so you'll see, people will want to come stand in the background, and some of that will be a little bit challenging to control, but you can't control who speaks, and that is very important. So during the actual press conference, you're going to want to live stream these press conferences. Chances are your local media will be doing the same, but just to ensure that you have a record for your own agency that you can post on your YouTube page following, or whatever platform you use, because it'll be very important that the entire press conference is available for your community to watch in its entirety, and not just the sound bites that the news media chooses to pull out. Again, during that press conference, something you're always going to want to drive home is where people can get that updated information as things change. It's the days of waiting for information from press conference to press conference are gone, because we have social media, and there's no reason that as it's available to put out and it's appropriate to put out information, that information is getting out and not waiting hours in between press conferences. So again, emphasizing where you want people to go to get that information. And then, you're going to want to announce when your next press conference is going to be. That should be something set that this group that is doing the press conference has agreed upon, so that people know when to expect that next press conference. And then again, we talked about those bullet points that they were very helpful in our incident. So putting out those press conferences, those bullet points of things that were said during the press conference, have them available in the JIC, so everyone is on the same page with information. And then again, posting that press conference online after it's been recorded.
And then you again, we've talked so much about making sure that everyone's kind of on the same message and has the key messages, that we're all sharing. So just some things to think about when you're preparing, whether it's yourself or you're preparing that official, you're acting in that advisory role, rather, as they go through. And we keep saying it, but the first thing is to always keep the focus on the victims and their families, expressing empathy for them and everything you're saying. Things like, we'd like to express our sincere condolences to those who have lost their lives, and our thoughts are with those injured and their families. Things like that, always come across, showing that empathy for those affected. And then really focus on what your agency, and again, stay in your lane, make sure you're really with your agency and how you're responding right now. So, and that's going to be different for various agencies, right? The law enforcement's going to have a completely different update than the nonprofit organization, the non-government organization. That for the nonprofit organization, it might be things like, we're coordinating with officials, we're providing blood products to the hospital, we're bringing our volunteers in, and then talk about what you're preparing to do, like what's coming next, what is coming next, and what you're going to be doing. And again, make sure you stay in your lane with that part of it, that you're not speculating on what somebody else is going to be. You're talking about your own agency and your own agency's examples. You're supporting the emergency officials. You're continuing to coordinate with the local officials to set up a feeding kitchen somewhere, to set up a family and friend notification center, and providing mental health support there. Again, staying in your lane is so important. You want to redirect those questions that are not directly related to your agency to someone else. And that's where being at the briefing and knowing your partners, your PIO partners in the other agencies ahead of time is so helpful. For the nonprofit organization is not going to want to be answering questions about the number of fatalities or speculating on the investigation, talking about if things are shifting from search and rescue to recovery operations. Those aren't things that the nonprofit organization is going to should wade into. They're not our lane. So even if you've heard it, you don't know all the information. You don't know what you want to be released. So you need to focus on your own agency and what you're doing. And if you get a question that doesn't apply, you should direct them to the proper agency. So that's not our role. That's another agency's role. Let me get you to that person. And the last one is kind of specifically, obviously, for nonprofit organizations, but these types of mass casualty, domestic terrorist incidents, these are not the time to really be out there proactively soliciting donations for your agency in a public venue. These are situated, and that includes, media interviews and social media. Chances are you're going to say something more along the lines of, we have what we need right now, thanks to the support year round to be able to provide. We really want the focus right now to be on these individuals. So again, pushing that, it's not about you when these situations happen. It's about those families, those victims. And you want to make sure that you are not coming across as insensitive or that you're trying to capitalize on something of this tragic in nature.
One thing that Jay talked about was, empathy, of course, always to the victims. And something I've seen, and just a warning for those in law enforcement, if you're the lead PIO, we've seen it where, unfortunately, a law enforcement officer might be one of those casualties in a mass casualty incident. But it's important that when we deliver our messaging, our press conference, that's not the focus, or the primary focus is that we are empathetic to all victims. While that one may hurt the most, or maybe, obviously that personal relationship, that officer worked for this agency, et cetera. We just have to be aware of that and make sure that as you advise the executive, that we make that not the primary focus. So I just wanted to bring that up. I've seen it in the past. I just thought it was an important note there. Moving on to talk a little bit about the Family PIO Liaison Program. This was something that we implemented immediately following the theater shooting on a whim of just, hey, these families are dealing with crisis and tragedy, and yet the media wants to talk to them. And so the following day after the theater shooting, I dreamt up this idea and worked with our PIO program president from the region and asked for some assistance to help. So what it does is it gives the family a buffer to the media. So what we did is we assigned a victim advocate, which was already done. A victim advocate had been assigned already to each family that who lost a loved one in the theater shooting. And so we tag teamed that and assigned a professional PIO also to the family if they chose. It was completely optional. They wanted that, professional PIO. And so we used the advocates. We went to the families and asked if that was something they'd be interested in to help navigate the media as they also navigated their grief. And it just gives the families some space to grieve. And the professional PIO can just assist the family with dealing with the media and what, how to best respond, things like that. One thing that I was clear about is that this PIO is not the family spokesperson. That's not the role. It wouldn't be appropriate for them to write any sort of statement. If the family wanted to release a statement, that's fine. They could draft it and release it to the media. But really just to help them navigate And then something else to think about is the deceased social media that's still going to be out there, and working on ways to getting that shut down and things like that. But one thing that the media is going to find any picture they can of somebody that's been lost in a mass casualty event and post it. And the family, that may not be the picture they want out there. They may have a different one. And that's, those little things that a person who's never dealt with the media doesn't know how to get that out, or doesn't know how to navigate that. There's just something that, having a professional PIO with all those connections can just be like, just give it to me, I'll deal with it. Right. So just kind of things like that. Again, this is a pretty in-depth program with a lot of logistics behind it. I'd be happy to share with you if you're interested in learning more or seeing a full presentation. Please get with ICP, and we can help navigate that. But that's just kind of a quick view of something that we implemented that I know since then has been implemented in other communities, and I think it could be a good resource. Again, victim focused, which is really the point we're driving home today.
So Cassidy, just one thing, having responded to a number of things after the Aurora Theater shooting, and knowing that this has been a model that has been used in some of the other responses, it really does take the pressure off of someone who's never dealt with the media before and never dealt with the onslaught of calls and all of that kind of stuff. So it really has been helpful. And it's been used multiple times. So thank you for your creativity.
Yeah, and along those same lines, we heard from media after how much they appreciated being able to have one contact who they know is a professional PIO, and for the most part, media doesn't like to go up to people and that they know are grieving and trying to get a soundbite or whatever. They do want to respect that. And so they also appreciate it from that side, having a professional PIO that they could go through to seek information. So.
Oh, that's great. Great information.
So some other things to consider, that might be happening as these situations happen. We talked a little bit about elected officials and other celebrities. They might want to come and visit. Again, it's usually coming from the best place and the best intentions, but it can be a drain on your resources and take away from the mission of trying to support those victims and their families. So your role in communications and PIO is to make sure those are handled respectfully, that any politics are taken out of the situation, just like it's not the time for an agency to promote themselves. It's really not the time for someone to be promoting their own politics. So we take that emotional piece out of it. And make sure that's what the victims want. The victims and their families, they're not under any obligation to meet with those elected officials or to invite the elected officials or celebrities to a private ceremony or a private vigil or something like that. So again, maybe using that family PIO liaison to find out what they really want and to make sure that you're treating that dignitary with the proper respect, but that your focus still remains on the family and the victims, so that it's really what they want to do and that they're as comfortable as possible with that situation. Depending on the agency, you may be asked to provide support at memorials, at pop-up vigils, even on the scene. This is an example actually from the Boston Marathon, where just people brought memorials to the scene of the bombing there. And even if your agency isn't directly involved in those events, in those vigils, in those memorials, you'll want to be aware they're happening, both in case issues arise that you might need to mitigate. That's where there's a gathering and a lot of emotion. But I think more importantly than that is to make sure you're being respectful of those times and locations. If you know there's a major vigil, a major memorial that's taking place at a certain day and time, you don't want to schedule something else or be doing something else at the same time. You want to be as respectful as possible of those families. We talked about this earlier too. People are going to want to help. Those that are not affected are going to see this. It's going to tug at their heartstrings. They're going to want to help. And as we said earlier, that often thinks about just donating stuff. Sometimes it may be helpful. A lot of times it's not. They're bringing, used clothing. They're bringing homemade food that, especially in a setting like we're in now with COVID, is you really can't accept in a lot of places. But really before that, you couldn't either, because you can't verify safety. all of these things. And a lot of agencies don't accept those because they don't have the logistics to do that. I can, speak for the Red Cross. We usually try to find those partners ahead of time that can handle those in-kind donations that come in. So make sure as an overall response, that overall group, that you have a plan for how to accept, to store, and distribute those donations. You don't want to upset people by declining them. You'll want to get into this comes back to some of that early messaging too. What do we want? What don't we want? And where do we want you to go with it? And where don't we want you to go with it? But coordinating those pieces ahead of time can avoid some problems. And again, as we've said throughout the presentation, remember to keep the focus on their victims. This is probably not the time to ask for those financial donations to support your agency based on this response. These are not, you don't want to look like you're capitalizing on someone else's loss like this. And so keeping that focus on the families is we can't emphasize that enough. Some other long-term considerations, again, take care of yourself and other team members. We talked a little bit earlier about the psychological first aid, but these mass casualty events, they can be more stressful than usual on the responders, on yourselves. And so, the level of emotional intensity will affect everyone differently. So just make sure you're being as flexible and as patient as possible, and do so for yourself too. Make sure you're being a little patient with yourself and understand some of those reactions that you may have. Take care of yourself. You can't help others if you're not taking care of yourself. Can't take care of others if you're not taking care of yourself. So drink fluids, take frequent breaks, try and get as much sleep as you can. This is obviously very stressful, so that's difficult, but try and get as much sleep as you can. Make sure you're eating and not just picking at the snack table that's picked up, trying to eat as healthy and a full meal as you can. If possible, try to work a shorter shift than during a natural disaster or something, something else, or your normal day, because it's stressful. It piles up. And during that off time that you're able to get, try to limit your exposure to the news, try to reconnect with your own family, your own friends that are not involved with this event, and get away from it. Whether it's through an agency like the Red Cross or somebody else, there's probably mental health workers and volunteers that are a part of that response. And so making sure make sure you take advantage of them and talk to them. They're there to help. And again, we talked earlier about those common reactions to stress. Just knowing that they're there doesn't, that's a step, but then you need to be able to deal with those for yourself and take care of yourself. Because again, you can't take care of others unless you're taking care of yourself.
Another thing that you might deal with, especially if you're the law enforcement entity, is records requests. So, reports, body-worn camera, that kind of thing. So hopefully you have systems in place to deal with that, because there'll be a lot of them. And so you just want to make sure that that's something that you're working with, if you're dealing with the district attorney's office, those kind of things, that you're doing that and abiding by your open records acts in your state. So that's something that might come up in long term as after the incident. Another thing, in a sensitive item, is returning items to victims or their families. So, there's clearly in a crime scene, it's going to be large. Lot of thousands of things are going to be collected, gone through to see if it's evidence or not. Some things can quickly be identified. Okay, it's not evidence. We can return it. And then working with your victim advocates who are the experts in getting that stuff back to the families or the individuals that were there at the incident. And then being able to explain to those people some of the things that they won't be getting back, and making sure that it's clear to them as to why and how it's evidence and things like that. And sometimes there may be a point that you're returning something that we might want to consider cleaning up before you hand it over to the family. Blood or something like that. So make sure that when you're giving an item back, that it's appropriate and that it's done with empathy and care.
So I'm just going to throw in there that sometimes, depending on the volume of that, jurisdictions don't have the ability to do that effectively. And so even if it's not a federal crime or it's not something that's large enough to bring the FBI in, we have seen the FBI victim specialists come in to handle the return of personal effects. And that happened in Las Vegas. Las Vegas was that was a state crime. So the FBI was asked to come in and do that. That was the largest field of personal effects that were collected. Just for scope, there were 600 white iPhone 6s. So that just if you take iPhone 6s and all of them, and then just take the white ones, there were 600 of them that were left on that field. And so sometimes it is incredibly overwhelming, but people really want those things back, and getting them back makes such an incredible difference to families and to people who were there. Very short story from Las Vegas. There was a victim specialist who was sitting with a family, and a young girl, she's about 6 years old, was giving him incredibly detailed information about her backpack. It was a Dora the Explorer backpack, and everything that was in it, the number of pencils and the blanket and what color it was and how soft it was. And she was very obviously connected to this backpack and that it had been left there. He was able to find that backpack and bring it out to her. And truthfully, that is one of the most touching personal effects returns that I've ever seen. And I've seen a few, but just the weight that he was able to give that process, it was a Dora the Explorer backpack. And many of us would think, well, it's a Dora the Explorer backpack. It's not that big of a deal. To this 6-year-old, it was everything. And she had just lived through this horrible event. And getting that back meant the absolute world to her. So just thinking about the fact that it's hard to do that, but it's so important. And if it's large enough, or even if you just don't have the capacity, the FBI has often been known to step in and assist with that.
Thank you. Another thing to consider is the thank yous and recognition to other agencies and community partners. Everybody steps up to the table when an incident like this occurs in your community, and just trying to track that during the chaos sometimes can be a challenge. But when you go back and reflect, those are important recognitions that need to happen. And then also, usually first responders and hospitals and paramedic staff, usually there's quite heroic things that happen and we see as a result of these incidents. And so those are important to recognize, whether it be a formal awards when it becomes appropriate, that kind of thing. The other long-term consideration, we've talked a lot about remembrances and things like that. And it's, when those things happen, it stirs up different things. And as a first responder, every year on July 12th, the first responders, get together. Excuse me, July 20th, get together, and they meet at the theater, and they do a remembrance there. And that's something that some in our case, first responders may not want to go to. It may be too hard for them. And so I think it's important that that's always, as these things come up in the community, that it's always optional for those, in our case, first responders, because it could be too hard for people to go to. So,
and I think in that, on that note, as a PIO, a communications PIO, being able to put that out there, not just for first responders, but also for victims, families, community members, that there are going to be, this could be really hard, and you may see some symptoms come back, and you don't have to do this. What we want is that you take care of yourself, whatever way you do that, whether you're a first responder, a victim, a family member, a community member, that you take care of yourself. Some people will find this helpful. Some people will find it helpful in very small groups that are very self-selected. It sounds like in Aurora, that's what happened is they sort of pull together at the theater kind of a thing. So I think as a PIO, sometimes the messaging doesn't end after 1 or maybe even 2 years, but may happen again at year 5. We look at 9/11, which just happened the 20th anniversary. There were some PIOs from that day that came back on and talked about what it was like to have it be 20 years after that. So I think just to remember that when we say long term, we're talking long term. So, as a wrap up to all of this, looking at planning and relationships is really, really important. And the program that is bringing you this webinar today has a couple of things to help your communities think about this and plan for this. One is recorded webinars, very much like the one that you're seeing today. They are on our website, and the website is listed there. When you watch these, including this training today, when you watch it, if you're thinking, I'd like additional information, or I'd like to customize this to my community, I'd like to talk to Cassidy and or Jay about something that they said. Please feel free to do that. We have a system set up where you can call us. Our contact information is there. It's also on the website. And you can call us and we can schedule a follow-up specific to this topic. So that's true for this one about communications. We have other ones about schools and universities and hospitals and different things like that. So please know that that's an option, additional information or customization. Just understanding that planning overall is so important. And it's never a great idea to meet your partners at the moment of an incident. What we want to do is identify systems, identify shortfalls, give people a chance to practice in no-fault environments, in training and exercises, those kinds of things, because all of that, the relationships, the practice, the identifying all of that increases a community's resilience as a whole. So we're encouraging all of that. And in terms of planning, the ICPTTA program overall, again, looks at augmenting planning for communities. And we use those 16 best practices that Jay talked about at the beginning of this webinar. And what we do is individualize those for communities. So your communication strategy may be one component of that. But if you get your whole community involved, we can do all 16 components of that. So what you have again is the website on the left, and that QR code that is there will take you directly to the application. So that application is if your full community would like to take advantage of this program, you can click on that and fill out that application. If you just want to talk about this training and customize this training, then just contact us and we can set up that and get you in contact with the people that would be most helpful for you. So on that note, I want to say thank you to Jay and to Cassidy. It's incredible to have subject matter experts be able to be pulled in to talk about lessons learned, to talk about best practices, to talk about what you need to think about and plan for prior to an incident, because it makes such a huge difference. So I want to thank them. I want to thank you for watching, and we hope to hear from you.